Vivian, I'm going to come to you in a minute to describe the essence of the entire national security strategy of the United States. But before we do that,
words are less.
I'm giving you like a 1-minute warning. Before we do that, I just want to read something that Anne wrote about this corruption issue. In Ukraine, the state itself is investigating the government, the cabinet, even the president's closest advisors. By contrast, it is impossible to imagine Kash Patel's FBI investigating anyone in Trump's White House. This may very well be true. It is also true that they have a serious corruption scandal and that he's been weakened. Zelensky has been weakened. How, both of you handle that question. How bad is it for Zelensky right now?
So I think it's important to understand, first of all, that this is the Ukrainian state investigating itself. Mm-hmm. So the democratically elected Ukrainian government and people appointed by it and supported by civil society, these are civil servants, and they are doing the investigation in accordance with the rule of law. And it's a reflection.
He's weakened by the existence of this.
He's weakened by it. He's lost some of his advisors and so on. But it's actually, so inside Ukraine, it's perceived as good.
Right.
Like it's a positive thing. And when I spoke to one of the chief detective who was leading that investigation a few days ago, and he said to me, and I asked him, aren't you worried this will weaken the state? He said, no, it's the opposite. Our state is weakened by corruption. Corruption equals Russia.
We can come back to this because there's a certain interesting analog here to what's going on here in our investigative capabilities inside the government. But Vivian, I do want to come to the national security strategy because this is all being done within the framework of a pretty radical new understanding of America and its role in the world. What did the national security strategy say?
What didn't it say? I mean, first of all, a lot of every administration puts out a national security strategy, lays out its policy priorities for the 4 or 8 years that they're in office. President Trump, his strategy was released. And first of all, just tonally, it's different. You have a lot of the rhetorical flourishes that you hear from President Trump and a lot of his advisors, just sort of this adversarial language that we see so much out of the White House. But then also, you have completely upended priorities, beginning with, and not least of which, is this concept of major power competitions, which the previous 2 administrations, and when I say the previous 2, I'm also talking about Trump 1.0, this was a key element for them, the power competition with China and with Russia. This strategy does not even mention China until 2/3 of the way in. He describes it as working to rebalance the economic relationship with China and not trying to push back on their efforts for global dominance, let's say. He talks about managing Europe's relationship with Russia rather than any kind of aggression that Russia may be pursuing and or any kind of tactics it may do to subvert America's allies. And so this was like one of the most glaring differences that we've seen. But also the language that they use about Europe was so striking. It discusses discusses Europe in very ideological terms. I mean, we're talking about the Ukraine conflict right now and how President Trump views it. That sort of manifested itself in the rhetoric toward Europe, where it talked about this need to restore Europe's, quote, civilization, self-confidence, and Western identity, talking about the need to push back on immigration, the need to push back on the economic cooperation with Western allies, and it is very, very striking to see the language it used in Europe.
Susan, what struck you the most about the national security strategy?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's Donald Trump repudiating Donald Trump's first national security strategy, which was all about the pivot to a great power competition between Russia, China, the United States. Now, essentially, Russia is treated as an equal of our European allies and partners. And it's not just that. They're literally talking about intervening in the internal politics of our European partners and saying we should operate for some national security reason to change the governments in countries we don't like. And this is very comparable to a speech that J.D. Vance, the vice president, gave at the Munich Security Conference at the beginning of this administration, in which he went there and he really shocked Europe by going to Germany and saying you should support the very radical far-right party, the AfD, in Germany. And essentially, this is codifying that approach and saying we're going to advocate regime change for our own allies.
It hammered European allies for trying to, quote, subvert free speech as well. This is one of the issues that it really went after European
Well, we can break that out, because there is
means-
some interesting differences in the way that they deal with free speech, and the things that some Western European countries do that would be onerous to us. But that's ultimately a minor question compared to something I want to ask you, Amna, about, which is, it seems as if what the Trump administration is doing is saying, there are spheres of influence in the world.
Yes.
And we'll acknowledge that. It's not been an American pattern. We don't recognize that China has primacy, traditionally, recognize that China is primary in Asia and Russia is primary in Europe. We're a global power. But now it seems as if he's saying, okay, Xi, you take Asia, Putin, you're over there, we're in the Western Hemisphere, and we're not advocating for democracy or freedom anymore. It's just you do your thing, we'll do ours. Am I wrong about
No,
this
and I
analysis?
think the latter part of what you're saying there is key in terms of the shift. And this is less about a strategy and more a statement of values, as Vivian articulated. It's America first on the world stage, which manifests itself in sort of the normalizing of anti-democratic and authoritarian regimes. That the parts of those powers that previous administrations would decry as things that a Western liberal democracy like America should stand up against, that language is not in here. And so you see a mimicking in foreign policy of a lot of what the domestic political priorities have been. There's a real emphasis on trade and commerce as sort of the leading force in a lot of these. There's pushback on immigration, and specifically on discouraging mass migration. They go so far as to warn against civilizational erasure in Europe as a result of migration.
Is this a projected fear?
It is a projected fear that we've heard articulated from a number of different administration officials. And look, we've all acknowledged the worldview of this administration is just different than the previous one. Like, they do not believe that there's a value in global alliances, or that globalization it has a benefit to it, or that
The previous
America,
one or all previous ones?
most previous ones, I guess, a
Republican and
post-war,
Democrat.
correct, or that America should be a global organizing power of some kind.
Right.
And so I think it's fair to say, like, the Western liberal, small d democratic values that dominated the post-war world order, those are gone in this administration.
And where does Venezuela fit into this?
I mean, Venezuela is a very peculiar subject because the main reason why the U.S. was in conflict in Venezuela over the last 20 years, or I don't know exactly how many years, was because the Venezuelan regime was an undemocratic regime that also had poor economic policies that destroyed the country. And it was in American interest to make Venezuela into a different and better place. But you don't hear any of that language coming from the Trump administration. They don't talk about liberal democracy in Venezuela. They don't talk about the fact that there is a legitimate, democratically elected Venezuelan president who was forced out of the country, who now lives in Spain. And it makes it a strange kind of war. Why are we there? Is it for oil? I mean, maybe. Is it because the administration needs a war to show that there's a reason why we need to fight against narco-traffickers inside the United States? Is it because we need to persecute brown-skinned immigrants in our cities? I mean, there's a kind of, I guess it's the national security strategy at work, but it's also an illustration of what's wrong with the national security strategy. And we can't actually identify what exactly is the thing. Why are we actually going to war in Venezuela? Why are we bombing Venezuelan ships? And I think that permeates this whole strategy. I mean, I read that strategy as a kind of long suicide note. I mean, we're not able to identify our enemies anymore. The people who are, for example, there was just this week news of Russians trying to infiltrate American infrastructure, even in places in California and different parts of the country. And we've forgotten about all that. We're not interested in cyber war. Instead, we're trying to refocus for ideological domestic reasons on, I don't know, the Western Hemisphere, and that's why we're doing it.
Right. It's almost as if there's only the Western Hemisphere, and whatever happens in Europe and Asia doesn't seem to matter anymore. The reason I raise that is because I want to show you what the NATO Secretary General, Mark Rutte, just said about Russia's intentions, or what he believes to be Russia's intentions. Take a listen.
We are Russia's next target. And we are already in harm's way. Too many believe that time is on our side. It is not. The time for action is now. Allied defense spending and production must rise rapidly.
So Putin was recently quoted as saying, quote, "We are not planning to fight with Europe, but if Europe suddenly starts a war with us, we are ready." I bring this up because, of course, he doesn't argue, let's put it this way, he argues that Ukraine started the war that he started. So he's perfectly capable of all that kind of verbal subterfuge. Is he right? Is it coming sooner than we in America think?
The Russians are preparing for a very long conflict. They've reoriented their entire economy to military production. They are even taking the Ukrainian children that they've kidnapped, they're training them to be soldiers. Putin himself has said, half jokingly, but not entirely, that any place that there ever has been a Russian soldier in the past can be there in the future. And that includes not just the Baltic states, but East Germany.
What about Alaska?
There's Alaska. Actually, the Tsarist troops were in France. So I mean, it could. The Russian strategy has always been push everything as far as you can, take what you can take. Only stop when you're stopped. Yeah. And if he's not stopped in Ukraine, he'll go further.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing is Lenin's line about press the steel forward till press forward till you hit steel. And I think the remarkable thing about listening to the NATO Secretary General is that his great anxiety this year has been to manage not just Vladimir Putin, but Donald Trump. And, if the United States is currently, as it looks like under the Trump administration, essentially overseeing the slow creeping end of NATO as we knew it, right? The United States now talks routinely about NATO as some separate entity. Donald Trump, of course, has publicly questioned whether he would ever go to war on behalf of a NATO ally. And I think if you are one of those countries or Russia, you have to expect that there will be a test that comes at some point in the future. Rutte flattered over the top Donald Trump earlier this year. He called him daddy. And here was Donald Trump just this week mocking him because he believes that Europe is weak. That's what Trump said in an interview. These leaders are weak and Vladimir Putin is strong and I'm for the strong. And calling him daddy, it's not secured NATO's future. It's reinforced the idea that the European leaders are weak.
The first rule of Fight Club, never call Donald Trump daddy.
Yeah.
By
Even
the
if he's
way,
your daddy.
can we just agree upon that? Whoever advised him.
Vivian, I want to ask you, related to this, Denmark this week, its national intelligence agency, warned Danish leaders, this is a NATO country, that the U.S. now poses a security risk to their own national security in Greenland, but not just Greenland, obviously. We're in a new world. Was that leaked to demonstrate anxiety, or is that a real anxiety that the U.S. would go to war with Denmark?
I don't think it's a real anxiety that it would go to war with Denmark. I think there is this sense that the provocative language that comes out of the White House currently could bring some unwelcomed attacks, some unwelcome threats that were not present before this. And you hear this from nations across Europe. And the thing that I do hear from European officials constantly is that they do credit President Trump for sort of lighting the flame under their bottoms to get them to increase their defense spending during his first administration, usually through threats. But he did threaten them to increase their defense spending, and they are all pushing to achieve that goal. But they still have such a long way to go, and you heard that in Rutte's language right now, where they realize that the threats are very real, and they are not where they should be yet. But they are moving in that direction.
Right. Well, this is a fascinating question, because I've always been torn on this. Is Donald Trump threatening NATO simply to get them to spend more money? The thing he hates most is being ripped off.
Right. The US
So is this all
advantage.
is this all a ploy to just get them to buy more American equipment, for one thing, or does he simply not like democracies? I mean, this is what we're going to be finding out in the next 3 years, I guess.
So two things are true here. One is that this idea that people need to pull their own weight when it comes to national security defense standards, that goes back to Trump 1.0. Like this is consistent, right? And as Vivian's point.
And they weren't spending enough.
Correct. At the same time, this is the president who, both rhetorically and in action, has not done all he can to uphold democratic values. He has said outright, anti-democratic things. He has praised authoritarians. So Western liberal democratic ideals do not seem to be a priority for this president, according to his own words. What I want to underscore here in terms of what Vivian and everyone has mentioned is even if the U.S. doesn't go to war with Denmark, we are in an environment now where the suspicion and mistrust from what you hear from European officials and the way that they view what the U.S. is saying and doing now is bad for U.S. national security as well. There was that leaked phone call with Macron and Zelensky, other European officials, where he was warning people that the U.S. could betray Ukraine when it comes to the security guarantees.
Right.
Which is a real fear.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there for now. We'll discuss the future of Europe next week, probably. But I want to thank our guests for joining me.